Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
He's written a most interesting book, General Gordon Granger, The Savior of Chickamauga, The Man Behind Juneteenth. So there's two aspects to him. He was sort of a forgotten guy. Someone was here, Dave here in the front row, was when he was 9 years old. He was at the 75th anniversary of Chickamauga, and he was saying Granger was hardly mentioned. Is that what you're saying? And this is the first book about General Gordon Granger. So here's Bob Connor to tell us about General Gordon Granger.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for your hospitality. Joe also interviewed me for the local TV station, which some of you may have seen, and I certainly did a good job, and I appreciate that. I guess it's David, right? David Fonseca, is that your name? Yeah, who was just talking to me before a few minutes ago. And it's not just that he was there when he was 9 years old. He also lived in the Chattanooga area for quite a while, I guess. And
I grew up in the Chattanooga area, went to college there and everything.
Right, so I think he has a fair amount of knowledge of the Battle of Chickamauga, and maybe more than me in some areas, so I'm going to have to watch it. I was, that guy over there, I went over to look at his, Mr. Stedman. He's in the corner there, the guy in a beard and glasses. I don't know anything about Mr. Stedman, but his name is the same with one spelling difference from a man in Granger's story. And it just occurs to me sort of the interest in obscure figures. There's a General Stedman, a brigadier general, S with two E's in his name, but pronounced the same way, who was also at the Battle of Chickamauga serving under Granger, as Granger was serving under George Thomas, who was the Rock of Chickamauga, came to be known as. And Thomas was serving under General William Rosecrans, who, although he had an otherwise distinguished record in the Civil War, ran away with several other senior officers on the second day of that battle when much of the Union line collapsed. I mentioned, before I get too far into the weeds of Civil War stuff, although I know some of you are obviously interested in Civil War history, but you never know with a group, so I want to talk about kind of some of the context of writing a book in the modern world also and tying it into the Civil War. So Stedman, for example, not that guy, but the General Stedman was somebody I considered writing a book about before I settled on writing a book about Granger instead. And maybe one of you should write a book about Stedman. And I guess my point is that it's not as hard to write a book or as impossible to get a book published as some of us might have assumed. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised that it went fairly well, the publication process. And Stedman, like Granger, like many people whom most Americans have never heard of, really led these fascinating lives and did these incredible things during the Civil War, because the Civil War was such a huge event in American history that there are these it was such a huge and dramatic event in American history with all these different stories in it, most of which are really unknown to the vast majority of people, and they're waiting there to be told, and perhaps by you or somebody. But Stedman, as I say, was serving under Granger. I'll just go back to Chickamauga. That he went into the attack at Snodgrass Hill, at the Union counterattack, which was striving to hold off the collapse of the rest of the Union line, when the General James Longstreet, or Pete as he was nicknamed, the Confederate general in charge of that part of the Confederate line, was trying to basically break the whole Union Army, which would have led probably to its complete capture. which would have been a huge disaster for the Union cause and could actually have changed the results of the Civil War. It may seem odd to say that obscure people like Granger and Stedman could have affected the course of American history to that extent, but I think it's actually true. Stedman went into the attack with his troops. He was quite heroic at the Battle of Chickamauga, and they did hold that line. Granger was not in the attack with the troops, although his hat was pierced by a bullet or shell fire at Chickamauga, and he certainly displayed personal courage on that occasion and on many others in both the Civil War and in the Mexican War 15 years earlier. But Granger was holding back because he was in charge of more troops than just Stedman's, and also was really functioning as Thomas's second in command on the entire Snodgrass Hill position. And when Thomas left at about 5 o'clock that day to coordinate the Union retreat, because he was in command of other troops than just the ones at Snodgrass Hill, Granger was left in command there and helped Thomas withdraw the Union Army, the part of the half of the Union Army that had not fled in disorder, drew back in good order about halfway to Chattanooga, and then the next day withdrew the rest of the way. If Thomas's position had not held, that army would have been captured, which no Union army was, or no large-scale Union army like this army, which was the Army of the Cumberland, was ever captured during the Civil War. Ulysses Grant captured 3 Confederate armies during the war at Donelson, Vicksburg, and Appomattox, so it could be done and was done by Grant. And if it had been done to the Union Army at Chickamauga, there would have been no Union victory 2 months later at Chattanooga. And Lincoln's re-election the next year in 1864 would have been much more difficult, and it was already difficult enough. There was a period during 1864 when Lincoln thought he would lose that election. And if Lincoln had lost that election, it could have led to a compromised peace, and the United States might not have existed as it exists today. And God knows what might have happened. That might have been, if alternative history is always amusing to contemplate, but in my opinion, if the Confederacy had established itself, there probably would have been additional wars between the two countries, more or less like Europe in the 20th century. And so the entire history of the United States and the world would have been different. So I'm not really saying that Gordon Granger is the man who changed the history of the world, but you could argue it that way. The Granger at Chickamauga was in charge of the Reserve Corps and did not see much fighting in the first couple of days of the battle. The battle starts kind of with skirmishing on the 18th of September, and there's severe fighting on the 19th. Granger is at the northern end of the battle, basically guarding a mountain pass going back in the direction of Chattanooga. And his orders are ambiguous, and he's sort of, on the one hand, he's told to keep open a line of retreat, basically. But on the other, he is also authorized to give support to people that need it. But he has not received more explicit orders than this on the morning of September 20th, when he hears the sounds of this tremendous battle going on to his south. And he sends messengers out, because he's not on the telegraph at this point. He sends messengers out to Rosecrans, and 3 to Rosecrans, actually, and 1 to Thomas, trying to get orders or to figure out what he is supposed to do. None of the messengers find Rosecrans, nor does the 1 to Thomas get through. The reason is that Rosecrans has fled back to Chattanooga, and that Thomas is embroiled in this very severe fighting. The Granger, on his own authority, with Stedman and Stedman, I guess, had a couple of Stedman was commanding slightly more than half of Granger's troops, and there was a colonel who was commanding the rest. But those troops marched with Granger to the relief, to the sound of the guns, basically, which is how Ambrose Bierce categorized it later after the war. Bierce, the American writer who was serving as a junior officer at Snodgrass Hill. They come up against, they're attacked by Confederate troops under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Stedman prepares to launch a counterattack against Forrest troops, but Granger comes up to him and says, no, we can't afford to do that. We've got to keep going to the main battle, which is the second key decision he makes that day. So they keep marching southwest, I guess they're marching. Thomas, on Snodgrass Hill, sees this body of troops approaching and does not know whether they are Union troops or Confederate troops, which is a pretty amazing position for Major General George Thomas to be in. Eventually, they make it out. There's a United States flag flying, and because if they had been Confederate troops, the battle would have been over. There's no way Thomas could have maintained his position. But they are Union troops, and they do hold out until nightfall, and so the Union Army is saved. So that is the key day of Thomas in the war, and Granger in the war, and Stedman in the war, that all serving in rows under each other. Granger and Stedman and many other people in the war, though, did lots of other interesting things. And the subtitle of the book, and I'll just hit these two big things, but I'm certainly happy, obviously, to talk about, and will talk about, lots of other stuff. But the subtitle says, The Savior of Chickamauga and the Man Behind Juneteenth. Juneteenth is actually an event not in the Civil War, but it's intimately connected to it, and is still, and increasingly actually, a celebrated holiday in many American states and areas, including this area. There you can find Juneteenth celebrations in Schenectady and Troy, I think. Juneteenth is June 19th. It comes from African-American dialect, which is shortened to Juneteenth, Texas African-American dialect. And it refers to an order issued by Gordon Granger in Galveston, Texas, on June 19th of 1865. Granger, who after Chickamauga and Chattanooga and serving in East Tennessee, went to Mobile, Alabama for the last 8 months of the war, or he wasn't in Mobile till they captured it, but he was working on that campaign for almost 2/3 of a year at the end of the war. He's then sent to Texas as commander of all United States troops in Texas. And there it is his job to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. Texas, unlike the rest of the South, had not been conquered by the United States Army. There was fighting in Texas during the Civil War. The Confederates were largely successful and largely fended off the Union attacks. So at the end of the war, the United States government has got to take control of Texas. So they send in federal troops under Granger. And Granger is now serving under General Philip Sheridan, who there's a little bit of a backstory there, that Granger had previously commanded Sheridan for quite a long while, that in fact he was really a mentor of Sheridan, who had recommended Sheridan from promotion from captain to colonel in 1862, and then from colonel to brigadier general also in 1862. And Sheridan was serving under him then, and then again served under him at the Battle of Chattanooga and in East Tennessee. That's in 1863-4. But by 1865, Sheridan is over Granger, and that's because Sheridan was a favorite of Ulysses S. Grant, whereas Granger was the opposite of a favorite of Grant's. That Grant and Granger did not get on, and I'll get into that in a bit. If you're more interested in the details of that, I'm going to be doing a talk at Grant Cottage on June 22nd, which I'll get into the nitty-gritty of the Grant-Granger relationship. But Sheridan, anyway, was in command of Granger in 1865. Sheridan was headquartered in New Orleans, though, was not based in Texas. And the concern of Sheridan at that time, as you can see from his memoirs, and of Grant, was not really the internal condition of Texas, nor the enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. Their concern was Mexico, which is a whole other story that I won't get into in detail unless you want to ask me questions. But there was a civil war in Mexico. The United States government was on one side of that civil war because they felt the Monroe Doctrine had been violated during the Civil War by France, basically, which had installed an Austrian emperor, Maximilian, in Mexico. And Grant and Sheridan wanted to put U.S. troops on the border and to help what they called the Mexican Patriots under Benito Juarez defeat the Maximilian regime in Mexico, which Juarez eventually did. But Granger's, so he was getting reinforced during the brief time that he was in Texas, but those troops were all going to the border, and meanwhile he had to enforce law and order and the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas. Slavery had existed in Texas up until this time. The Emancipation Proclamation had had no effect in Texas because it was under Confederate control, and many Confederate slave owners had in fact gone to Texas to protect their slaves, so that slavery was entrenched in Texas. If you read the Texas newspapers of the time, you'll discover that they really did not expect the Emancipation Proclamation to be enforced. They thought that it was impossible for a Texas economy to function without slavery, or at least with some kind of forced labor. Granger's order disillusioned them of that. And in fact, Granger's order of June 19th went further than Sheridan's orders. Sheridan had ordered him to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, but to instruct the slaves to remain at where they were. Granger merely advised the slaves to stay where they were because he realized, being free people, he could no longer instruct them to do anything. And he also put in explicit language in his order, which explicitly said that the slaves would have all the civil rights of anybody else. And it's really one of the most significant documents of Reconstruction, and had a large effect in Texas, despite the poor communications there, that it was published in newspapers and among both the black and white community and the larger American community. It was noticed in Washington and by the New York Times, obviously, and other newspapers. So it was a significant document, and was celebrated in Texas by the African American community thereafter. The African American community in Texas survived the end of Reconstruction better than African Americans in some other southern states, the reimposition of Jim Crow laws. The African Americans continued to be able to get elected in Texas to significant offices, and historians think that the consciousness of those Juneteenth celebrations is part of the reason for that. And as I say, they still do continue, really, on a nationwide basis as a celebration of the end of slavery, because slavery was not ended per se by the Emancipation Proclamation, nor by the 13th Amendment, which had not yet been ratified in June 1865, so it was not yet the law. It was really ended by the United States Army winning the Civil War, and in the case of Texas, it ended suddenly with Granger's order and the occupation of Texas by U.S. troops, although there were very few U.S. troops for a very large state of Texas. Now, I don't want to imply that Granger is some kind of spotless knight hero of racial politics or anything else, because he's clearly not. He, I think, is more or less in tune throughout his life with mainstream Northern opinion on racial issues. He starts off pretty conservative. He's a friend of George McClellan, the conservative Unionist general in the first part of the war that some of you are probably familiar with. And he moves, though, unlike McClellan, he's able to move with the Lincoln administration and afterwards to conform his views to the evolving national policy on slavery and race relations. However, after Juneteenth, he's prepared to conform it back again in tune with President Andrew Johnson, who is a friend and ally of Granger's, that he's known Johnson from his military service in Tennessee. And when Grant eases Granger out of a military job in early 1864, Johnson helps him get back into senior Army command in the Mobile campaign. And Johnson, although he starts off as kind of a gung-ho, seeking revenge on the South type of politician. He wants Lee, for example, indicted for treason until Grant gets him to back off. But then Johnson quickly switches and becomes this opponent of black rights, including black voting rights. And Granger is kind of willing to go along with Johnson, although he's also in Reconstruction serving under Thomas in the South, in Tennessee. And Thomas was a pretty firm supporter of Reconstruction, and Granger did not have any conflict with him either. Then later, he serves out west in the Grant administration. He's serving as commander of the District of New Mexico. He negotiates with the Apache chief Cochise. Just before Cochise does make a peace treaty with the Americans. This is a part of Grant's peace policy with the American Indians. But Granger's health is poor by this time, and he goes on a long sick leave. There are a few local connections. Granger is from upstate New York. He's from western New York. I went out there. He's from what was then a hamlet that was growing into a little hamlet of Joy, New York, in Wayne County. It's now, there's really nothing left of that hamlet. It's in the middle of orchards now. It's still a quiet rural part of the world. There is the one-room schoolhouse that Granger went to is still there. It's there without any sign at all, and I guess it's now used as a place for voting and community meetings. He, oddly, Granger, who was really a pretty rough and ready character, but he, before he went to West Point, he had a couple of years in his late teens as a school teacher himself in one-room schoolhouses up in Wayne County. But then he spent the rest of his life in the Army, which makes him a little bit unusual because there was so much chopping and changing in the Army that most officers, by the time Granger died, had not spent their careers in the Army. They'd got in, they got out, Confederates got out and stayed out, and many people like Grant had resigned from the Army before the war, got back in during the war, and then out again after the war. But Granger stayed in his whole life. He was kind of goofing off after the war, which again did not endear him to Grant. He spent a good deal of time in Saratoga Springs, the seat of high society of the time. He married late in this period of his life. And then during his sick leave, his long sick leave from 1873 to 1875, he was living in Saratoga again during the summers and in Florida during the winters, a nice gig, I guess. But his infant daughter did die in Saratoga Springs in 1875. One thing about researching a book, especially a book about someone who's never been written about before, is that it's fun that you get to discover things that nobody's discovered before and put them into the historical record. Some of them are fairly trivial, like Granger's birth date. It's wrong. It was wrong on most of the historical records. I got Wikipedia to correct it, which I was happy to see. But there's things like his daughter, I found no record of her name or her date of birth or a date of death, and I thought I was just going to have to leave it like that, but I eventually did find that information up in Saratoga Springs, just in the files of the Bethesda Episcopal Church. They're still there on Washington Street office, and there's a file cabinet, and there was the card. On more kind of weighty historical matters, you've also got to kind of wade into some of the controversies. And I was just talking to Joe about this before the talk. I kind of tend to think that the people who've not had their own biographies tend to get the raw end of the deal, because it's easy to blame them for any blunders because nobody's really taking their side in the historical debates. There's a thing at the Battle of Chattanooga, which is a good example of that, I think, that the key charge in Chattanooga was the Battle of Missionary Ridge. And in that battle, Granger was commanding the two central divisions of the Union charge. So he played a key role in that. As a caveat, I would say that that battle, even though the best generals in the Union Army were there, i.e. Grant, Sherman, Thomas, and Sheridan, really none of those generals played a key role, or really any kind of role, if the truth be told, in the victory at Missionary Ridge, because Grant's orders ordered the troops to stop at the rifle pits at the base of the ridge, which they soon found when they got there was not a good place to stop. They were still subject to fire from the Confederates on the ridge above. So on their own, with junior officers and the rank and file just making the decision basically on their own, they went up that ridge, and one of the most extraordinary achievements in American military history, and won that battle. So that's kind of a caveat. I know it's easy for someone like me, especially who's never been in military or in any kind of warfare, to speak blithely about these terrible events, and to speak about generals who do play these key roles. But in this major battle, none of those generals was playing the key role in that victory. However, before the troops make that assault on Missionary Ridge, there is one of many controversies about that battle, which is that the order gets delayed. And the conventional historical record, including of good historians like Peter Cousins, whose book on Chickamauga I relied on, and Chattanooga, 2 books I relied on considerably, get it wrong, in my opinion. And as I think I demonstrate in this book, that what they say, and which as soon as I read it years ago always has seemed to me implausible, is that Granger was given an order to launch this attack, but got so involved in directing the operations of an artillery battery there on Orchard Knob, which is where all the senior generals except Sherman were, that he got so involved in this battery that he neglected to order his troops to make the attack. And then when somebody asked him why he'd not done that, he lied and said nobody had given him the order. Now, this just seems on its face to be ridiculous, to be something that is incredible. And it comes, I know why it came about. It came about from the pen basically of Charles Dana, who was a former newspaperman working for the War Department, working under Stanton, who'd been basically sent as Stanton's eyes and ears at first to see if Grant was a drunk or not, or should be promoted, and then generally to report back. And Stanton, by that, who was a huge booster of Granger after Chickamauga, had now been influenced by Grant, who was not a fan of Granger's, so was looking to interpret events, in my view, in Granger's disfavor. But I'm not saying he made it up, because there is a lot of confusion about what happened. What really happened, in my opinion, and it seems a much more plausible story, is that, and there's evidence for it in the book, that Grant was deferring to George Thomas. Grant had taken over this army, but Thomas was still the commanding general of the Army of the Cumberland. But Grant, as senior general, was on the scene, and so thus was in command. And Grant was making suggestions that Thomas launch an attack on Missionary Ridge, or he was speaking in such a way that Thomas interpreted it as suggestions and not as orders. And the two men, like Grant and Granger, had a bit of a frosty relationship, and so they kind of stood there and nothing happened. Now, that makes sense. The conventional view of history does not make sense, the conventional view of Granger's role in it. And so and it's not just that it makes sense, but there's evidence for it that that's what happened. Excuse me, I'm dropping my glasses. So there are other things like that. There's There's an error in Grant's memoirs. Grant's magnificent memoirs, which he finished, as you probably know, up at Grant Cottage in Saratoga County, have an error concerning a controversy, a separate controversy a few days later in Chattanooga when Granger was slow to march to the relief of Knoxville, which was being besieged by Longstreet, Union Army under General Ambrose Burnside. And Grant gets the days mixed up, so he makes Granger's departure seem a day later than it really was. But anyway, those are trivial matters. Let me just get back to why you should all be writing books. Maybe not all, but because it's fun, and you can find out stuff, and you can make real contributions to the historical record. The actual research going places is fun. I went to Chickamauga, to Chattanooga. I had to go to Chattanooga twice because, like an idiot, I went to the wrong place the first time. I'd just been to Chickamauga with my wife. We were on this trip, and so I figured I dragged her all day to this battle site, so I didn't want to spend too much time and press my luck dragging her around Chattanooga. So I didn't go on this trip to the National Park Service Museum up at the top of Lookout Mountain because Granger wasn't there. And I went to where I thought Orchard Knob was quickly, the military cemetery there, the National Cemetery. But that was not Orchard Knob. That was near Orchard Knob. So I had to go back to Chattanooga and back to Orchard Knob. Fortunately, that trip led me to Lexington, Kentucky, where I'd never been before, to Granger's tomb, to his burial site, where there was information about his daughter's gravestone, which I'd seen a record of before, but I hadn't quite believed it because it didn't sound right, but the record was right, and so that led me on to finding the details of her birth and death. Crucially, I found a descendant of Granger's, still alive, who was very helpful to writing the book. His name is Gordon Granger IV, and he is an old man living in Virginia, and he let me take photographs of and use letters by which Granger wrote late in his life when he was in New Mexico. But he didn't know lots of things. He didn't know about the daughter's, the details of her life, although he knew there had been a daughter. He didn't know, I don't think nobody knew until I dug something up out of Ancestry.com that Granger had descendants in Mexico because his only surviving child, his son, the ancestor of Gordon Granger IV, founded one family in Virginia, but then the marriage broke up and he went off and lived in Mexico the rest of his life. So there's a lot of research, obviously, is interesting. I'm an old newspaper man, so I like digging up stuff. The internet, which arguably has been destroying newspapers, or led to the end of my newspaper career and many other people's, and some might say it's destroying publishers, although, as I say, I was able to get this book published, is, despite its destructive tendencies, also extremely useful for research purposes. And the main use of it is that there's lots of records which are now online, like the records of the United States Army, which were during the Civil War, which were my main source during this book, and just full of reports and orders and details of movements about all of these events, which is great. And because the Civil War, as I mentioned earlier, is such a huge event, there are so many of these stories. People like Stedman, people like Granger. I was going to write another book. My next book, I was thinking of doing a book about immigrant generals of the Civil War, but I'm not going to do it. So anybody wants to write that, you can write that one too. But it's an incredible story. There's guys who grew up in Germany and Ireland and were living in obscurity in the United States in 1861, and then suddenly, a year or two later, they're commanding large numbers of troops in hugely important battles. It's just, there's story after story of extraordinary interest, in my view, in the Civil War, and lots to be written about. And so let's see, I think I've gone a bit over half an hour, and I'm happy to take questions. David, is that right?
Yes.
I know that you'll have some, and anybody else who wants to jump in, please do.
Well, let me just make a comment here about your book, because I've just about finished reading your book. One of the things that I think you brought out very well, I've read Bruce Kent, and I read Grant's memoirs, and I read Peter Cozen's books, and so forth. But what you did was really point out the political side where a lot of generals had to function during the Civil War. There was a political side to most of these generals, mainly caused by the fact that this was the whole question of emancipation of the slaves and everything. And the way politics were done during the Civil War meant that most generals had to be involved one way or another in politics. And I think you hit on that head very, very well, better than some of the other books, you see, which just deal with the operational side of battles in the Civil War. And
well, I
thank you
thanks.
for that.
Yeah, it's certainly true of Granger that there was, probably to the detriment of his military career, for about 2 years, he was not in any major battles from Wilson's Creek really till Chickamauga. He was involved in a good deal of skirmishing in Tennessee in 1863, but as David says, he was dealing with political issues really at a pretty, and mostly issues involving slavery. That in the beginning of the war, Lincoln was extremely concerned about the border states, about Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And in 2 of those states, Kentucky and Missouri, Granger was very active. And their main concern at the beginning, and it's a little uncomfortable, it's a matter of racial politics, was holding the loyalty of Unionists who were not by any means abolitionists. So there were lots of the white populations of the border states was by and large pro-slavery. And Lincoln was extremely concerned not to lose the support of those states because he thought that would mean that he would lose the entire Civil War. So the racial policy is very delicate, and Granger is savvy enough to move with it. So he's pretty conservative, trying to placate the white Unionists in the first half of the war. But as the war goes on, and especially as black troops come into the Union Army after the Emancipation Proclamation, then Granger is trying to protect them. In early 1865, he's communicating with the Confederate generals around Mobile, trying to prevent captured black soldiers from being re-enslaved. And then he goes to Juneteenth, and then there's the whole Reconstruction thing. So yeah, politics was a key part, certainly, of Granger's career. Yes, sir?
I'm not familiar with Wayne County. Where is that? Any big cities near there?
Wayne County is about in the middle between Syracuse and Rochester. It goes up to Lake Ontario. It was really, it's funny the way, it's kind of like when Granger's born in 1821, it's pretty wilderness-like. It's just starting to be settled, really, because it was kind of, that whole area was kind of disputed for a while at the end of the Revolutionary War, and it was not heavily settled. So even though you may not think of New York State in the 19th century as being part of the frontier, in some ways it really was. There was fighting there during the War of 1812, for example.
Is that Batavia?
No, Batavia is further west. Batavia is west of Rochester, and Wayne County is east of Rochester and west of Syracuse. Yes, sir?
You mentioned that he had early on been a teacher, but moved into the military. Can you explain the process where they become get a commission? I mean, he obviously didn't go to West Point, I don't think.
Oh, no, he did go to West Point.
Oh, he did go.
Yes. Stedman, who I mentioned earlier, did not go. There's lots of, and none of those immigrant generals went to West Point. And there's a lot of civilian generals like Stedman who rise to, but Granger was a career military man. He was only a teacher, I think. I don't have a lot of information about it, but from what I can gather, he's waiting to get the West Point appointment, which was then as now, it's not that easy to get. So he was using kind of political or personal influence to get appointed to West Point. He got it fairly late. He didn't go till he was 19. And in those last couple of years, he just was finding something to do, I think.
Well, then how did he happen to be appointed as general of the Cumberland Army, which wouldn't be typical of his area?
Well, it was during the Civil War. I mean, you got to remember, at the start of the Civil War, Granger was a lieutenant. He was a 39-year-old lieutenant, which is a pretty slow promotion track even in the peacetime U.S. Army. But if you look at Grant, he was a clerk in a leather goods store. I mean, in 1861, the majority of people who became famous in the Civil War were completely obscure. But the Union Army massively, the United States Army massively expands in 1861 and continues to expand for the next several years. That almost half the existing officer corps resigns. So the road to promotion resigns to join the Confederacy. So the road to promotion for U.S. officers is open because they desperately need people to command these raw recruits and to mold them into soldiers. And Granger was good at that. He was a good trainer and disciplinarian, sometimes maybe a little too heavy one, but he was pretty good at that. Yes, ma'am.
And the only book that I could find where there's any mention of Granger, it's a book on this is Grant.
Is the which?
It was a book on Grant.
Right.
But Granger was mentioned. But the only reference was that Granger seemed to argue with other people, military people, and actually sort of shot himself in the foot. He couldn't be promoted because of his negative attitude. Is this true?
Yes, but I would still. Granger was a difficult person. He was cantankerous. He was. If you look at it in one way, he's kind of a military swaggering martinet, a type that I don't think Grant liked. But some of his arguments, I mentioned briefly before the delay in going to the relief of Knoxville. The basic reason for that delay was Granger was trying to get supplies for his troops. Those troops had been through this terrible campaign, besieged in Chattanooga. They were, I don't believe they were back to full rations yet. I mean, they'd had this month after month of grinding campaign of heavy fighting and difficulty. They were ill-shod. Many of them had no shoes. They had no tents, no adequate coats. They were about to go into what turned out to be a bitter winter in the mountains of East Tennessee. The casualty figures from the Civil War are a little foggy, and the numbers are still being revised upwards. They now think about probably 750,000 people are killed, far more than any other American war. Most of those deaths are not in battle. And so the exact number of people Granger lost in that campaign to disease and just privation is not known, but it was high, and it would have been higher if he had not argued, and he did succeed in getting some more supplies sent up for his troops, but he was bitterly fighting for supplies all through that winter, and he was not at all shy about arguing with Grant or anybody else about that. Now, that said, there are also occasions when Granger behaved in ways that I'm not going to defend, like there's a drunken message he sends to Grant that winter at Christmas time after some party or something. And so Granger was a difficult person, but I know there is one modern school of biography which kind of tears down the party, but I'm not of that school, so I tend to sort of be on Granger's side. But I'm not going to whitewash him either. Yes, ma'am.
What did you conclude about Grant? Was he a drunkard or not?
Well, Grant is someone I have a great deal of respect for. I have a long association with Grant Cottage. I used to be the site interpreter there for a couple of seasons. Grant did have a drinking problem. I don't believe his decisions in the Civil War were affected by drink. Grant had a drinking problem in his youth, but it was mainly a problem when he was separated from his family. And it's not because Julia, his wife, is on his case or nagging him. It's that he's unhappy away from his wife and children. And there is some concern, even during the war. There's no evidence during the war that Grant in any battle was drunk or anything like that. But he does seem to have gone on a couple of benders. And the way they fix it, which may sound simplistic to modern ears, is but they bring him together with his family. And then really in the last half of Grant's life, there's no evidence of him drinking to excess. So drinking was an issue for Grant, but I don't think it's fair to call him a drunk. Yes, ma'am.
I'm intrigued by a couple of comments you made relating to Juneteenth, that he was in Texas, and also that he served in the Mexican War.
He did, yeah.
And a lot of the officers in the Civil War were in the Mexican War. What was his experience in the Mexican War, and did that in any way influence his later actions?
I don't know the answer to the last part of it, whether it influenced his actions. I do think that Granger was helped in his later career by his experience. He'd served, extensively on the Western frontier, across the South, so wherever he went after the war, he knew something about where he was going. The Mexican War was a controversial war and still remains so. Grant, in his memoirs at least, is strongly opposed to it. Lincoln was opposed to the Mexican War. Grant did fight in the Mexican War, though, as did Granger. And Granger was in Winfield Scott's campaign, which captured Mexico City in 1847 and brought the war to the end, and performed very bravely in it, won 2 brevet promotions for gallantry. The war, leaving aside the justice of it or the political reasons, was, for the U.S. Army, a very successful war. And it was not, even though obviously it's a much smaller war than the Civil War, for the small U.S. Army, it took pretty high casualties in it. So it was a serious war for the U.S. Army and an extremely successful one. And both Granger and Grant performed well in it. Yes, sir.
What was the highest rank that Granger achieved?
Major General, a volunteer. So after the war, he's back to being a colonel. Because you understand that, right? At the end of the Civil War, everybody gets demoted, or most people do. Yes, sir.
On the immigrant generals, the amount of research you did you look at the 1848 revolution veterans that were coming up?
Yeah, there were quite a few of them had connections to that. I'm not writing that book, although I'm writing a historical novel about the last 4 months in the life of Grant, and I stuck some of the I'm sticking some of them in that. But yeah, those revolutions some of those generals were refugees from those revolutions, including several Germans, I think. There's a Hungarian, a Pole, so yeah, that was indeed a factor. And I guess maybe you can include the Irish. Wasn't there some trouble in Ireland around then too? So. Yeah, there was a Hungarian guy, what's his name? Asboth, you know him? Yeah, he was a general. There was a Pole, Krasnowski, more Germans. I'm not sure that all of them are connected to 48, but I'm thinking of Osterhaus and Siegel, I guess, is German. And yeah, so there's...
The artillery specialist.
Yeah, Siegel was a good artilleryman, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so the immigrant generals are like the rest of the generals. Some of them are more successful than others, but it's really, to me, just an extraordinary story.
Any more questions?
Yes, sir.
Well, let me make a few comments here. A lot of what happened around Chattanooga, Battle of Waxahachie, the Battle of Lookout Mountain, the battle, which is the Battle above the Clouds, that's what it's called locally down in Chattanooga, and the Battle of Missionary Ridge, as well as Chickamauga. In many cases, it was determined by topography. Now at Chickamauga, for instance, Snodgrass Hill, the Union positions were on the hill, which is about 50 feet above the plains that the Confederates were attacking across. Because in looking at the point of the reenactment in 1938, when I was 9 years old, this is the way it was fought. This is what you saw, you see. Okay. Then there was the whole question. There's a battery on Lookout Mountain, 4-gun battery, Alabama battery, okay? It's out at Point Park, not too far from where the New York Peace Monument is. Okay. We used to go out there and look at that battery and read them.
That's right. New York troops at the top of Lookout Mountain.
Okay. Now, That thing about that battery, then my mother would say to me, oh, they couldn't fire those guns down on the Confederates down below. Well, they couldn't because they couldn't deflect the guns enough. They couldn't go out to Moccasin Point out there across the Tennessee River because the range was too far. So consequently, the artillery placement was poor, at least in terms of some of the Confederates.
Yeah, Missionary Ridge too, I think.
That's right, and I think you pointed that out in your book. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.